year antedating. But generally, military euphemisms go back a lot further than that. Ex-Minister of Defence Michael Portillo steps up to the dispatch box to argue that these veiled terms play a vital role in times of war.
In an age of spin doctors, you could be forgiven for thinking that military euphemisms date from the age of Blair and Bush. Not so. A decade ago, when I was Secretary of State for Defence and we were bombing Serbian pylons and bridges, chilling phrases like target-rich environment were already common. But fighting men have been using euphemisms for a very long time. For centuries, in fact.
Ancient Rome's legions came, saw, and conquered much of the world. One favoured Latin word for that was componere, meaning not to vanquish, but merely to pacify. And Anglo-Saxons wrote poetically of heroes having fallen when they'd actually died in battle. But it was in the two world wars of the 20th century that military euphemisms became a macabre art form. Phrases such as friendly fire, which roughly translates as getting shot at by your own side, originated in the trenches of the First World War. And combat fatigue, a veiled term for mental trauma, surfaced in the intensity of mechanised battle during World War II. When I ran the MOD, we were awash with euphemisms, and we were rightly satirised, not least by those like John O'Farrell, writing for Spitting Image.
Governments have absorbed some of these euphemisms from the military. Why do you think they've done that?
Well, I think firstly, they like to give the impression they're in the know and completely up to speed with all the sort of military jargon that gives the impression that they have the faintest idea what's going on, which no one does in war anyway. But also,
I plead guilty.
Well, actually, you wouldn't have been Minister of Defence 30 years earlier. You were Minister of War, technically, but that was a change. That
I was Secretary of Defence, which is a much softer term.
A much more acceptable phrase to the British public.
Who do you think are the worst offenders when it comes to devising these jargons and euphemisms?
No contest at all. I think it's the Pentagon. In the age of television, war is much more graphic and much more frightening. And so words are needed to soften the grim reality. Collateral damage is a word that is bandied around by the Pentagon and by the MOD. And that is dead people who weren't supposed to get shot at, basically. You can't say, well, we fired our missiles and we killed a load of kids in a nursery school. So they're going to say there was some collateral damage. And lately I've heard the word transfer tube, and that is finally a word which sort of hides what it really is. It sounds more like somebody changing on the Northern Line to the Hammersmith and City, when actually you're talking about dead bodies coming home from a war zone.
Transfer tubes. War today is something we view on television. Maybe we're losing our ability to distinguish between the real killing and what we see in movies. And building on that, political leaders can exploit military euphemisms to mask the brutal reality of mutilation and violent death.
But military euphemisms were invented not by politicians, but by fighting men. They must have had a reason for dreaming them up. Do they perhaps help in sustaining morale by glossing over the gory details of life and death in battle? How is this soft soaping regarded by the hard men who go to war?
For Colonel Nick Borwell, who's fought in all the recent theatres, euphemisms enable the soldier to laugh where the verbal direct hit would not.
Armies particularly develop a sort of gallows humour about what's going on around them. One of my, I suppose, favourites, because it's so awful, is the expression sympathetic detonation, where a soldier or a vehicle with ammunition on it or on the person, if it's hit, actually the ammunition goes off as well. Not much sympathetic about that. The presence of death on a battlefield or in military operations is something that is around the soldiers, if not all the time, but they learn to expect it and they learn to deal with it.
Whereas today's euphemisms for death are sterile and technocratic, those of yesteryear relied on gritty wit, like pushing up the daisies, which was first used of the fallen, or should I say dead, of the Great War. Another of my favourites reflects the grim jocularity of the brave pilots of World War II. Going for a Burton. Popping down for a pint of Burton's ale.
We used to be in a cafe, you know, in a drink, and RAF blokes were sitting by the side. They used to say, "Oh, Smithy's gone for a Burton." Well, we knew then that he'd been shot down. He no need to have been a pilot, he could have been an observer or gunner, but he'd been shot down and he's dead. That's what that means.
All of us in our daily lives use euphemisms to soften the blow of dread disease, disability and death. So why shouldn't the soldier, however brave, use the same technique to avoid dire reality for as long as he can? The problem has arisen in recent times when politicians have hijacked the euphemism in order to muddle and obscure. When they take us to war, we have the right to insist that they call a spade a spade.